September of this year, an organization called the Gravel Institute launched a campaign with the proclaimed goal of defeating PragerU. Following this announcement, they began posting weekly videos in the same style of PragerU, but from a more left-wing perspective. Today, I'd like to show you the most recent video and tell you why they're wrong about the Electoral College.
When Americans go to the polls to vote for the president, they're not actually voting for the president. Instead, their votes are tallied up and go to delegates called electors, who supposedly cast votes on behalf of the American people. Each state is given a set amount of electoral votes based on the number of each state's representatives, plus 2 for the senators who represent them in Congress. And in all but 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, the candidate who gets the most votes in each state gets all of the electors. So if a candidate wins the popular vote in a state like, say, Georgia by only a few thousand votes, they'll get all of Georgia's 16 electoral votes.
So far, so good. Everything they've said up to this point has been completely true, as they're just explaining how the Electoral College works.
Now, of the entire Electoral College, you only need 270 electoral votes to win. This means that candidates can win the popular vote but lose the Electoral College and therefore the election. It's already happened 5 times. For a democracy, this sounds kind of undemocratic, right?
They're also correct here. The Electoral College is very anti-democratic. So why in the world then would our founding fathers design it that way? Well, according to this video, to preserve slavery.
The founders were mostly merchants, bankers, slave traders, and wealthy planters. Their goal was to preserve elite rule and prevent mass democratic movements, such as the abolition of slavery, from taking hold.
And there we have it, our first outright lie. Anyone who studies history knows that the founding fathers actively opposed slavery. Even Abraham Lincoln knew this. In a speech he gave in 1854, he recognized that the men who founded our country were the same ones who established the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which completely banned slavery in the vast Northwest territories. This was the first step toward nationwide abolition, and our founding fathers gladly took it. So if it wasn't to preserve slavery, why in the world would our founding fathers create the Electoral College? To find that out, we need to keep watching.
And in the last 20 years, it has allowed candidates who have lost the popular vote to claim the presidency twice. It's consistently served to entrench the rule of a minority. In some ways, our country is even less democratic than many of its designers envisioned. Even James Madison, the chief framer of the Constitution, wanted a constitutional amendment to ban the winner-take-all rules that decide the Electoral College today. So while the Electoral College's defenders claim that it protects against a hypothetical tyranny of the majority, the fact is that it enshrines something much worse, a tyranny of the minority.
And here we have the second major lie in this video, that you don't need to worry about tyranny of the majority. But this so-called hypothetical tyranny of the majority is what led to the violent demise of democracies throughout all of history. It's very interesting that they quote James Madison in this video, because a year before the Constitutional Convention, James Madison spent a year studying the failings of democracies all throughout history, and he found one very common trend: mob rule. In direct democracies, powerful factions and passionate mobs were able to suppress the voice of reason. The government of Athens is a prime example of this. Their implementation of direct democracy allowed faction leaders and politicians to control large minorities. In order to oppress the 49%, they only had to convince the 51. But this wasn't just a problem of ancient times. It was happening in America. In Massachusetts, as Madison observes, a rage for paper money, for abolition of debts, and for an equal division of property was gaining ground. This eventually led to the Shays Rebellion, in which a mob of debtors, the majority, waged war against their creditors. Sobered by these failures of government, Madison was determined not to let the same fate befall America at large. And from this determination came the famous separation of powers as described in the Constitution, and consequently the Electoral College. This way, the power of executive election would be spread out evenly across the country, rather than just given to the few states that are most populated.
Because of how polarized presidential elections typically are, the vast majority of voters, as much as 75% of them, have basically no voice in the presidential race. If you're a Republican in a Democratic state like New York, or a Democrat in a Republican state like Mississippi, your vote can feel practically worthless. In fact, unless you live in one of the 5 or 6 states that tend to decide every general election, you get no attention at all in a presidential campaign that's allegedly supposed to be about who should represent you.
This idea that your vote doesn't matter unless you live in a few select states is pure fiction, and in fact the Electoral College is the very thing preventing this. If the president was elected by individuals directly, states with higher population like California, Texas, and Florida would have massive control over the election, while smaller states would have almost no influence. This would allow candidates to win elections by merely pandering to the wishes of these big states, while completely ignoring the needs of smaller states. The Electoral College prevents such an imbalance of power. With electoral influence spread across the country evenly, candidates must gain the favor of the country at large, rather than just in a few select areas. But what about swing states, you might ask? Don't they have more power in elections than other states? Well, actually no. Now, this confused me at first, so let me take a quick moment and explain the difference between swing states and safe states. You see, certain states are populated mostly by supporters of one party. Therefore, that state will generally support that party during elections. A great example of this is California, which almost always votes Democrat in elections because most of the population in California is Democrat. Other states, however, are more evenly split, with neither Republicans or Democrats making up the vast majority of the population. It's these undecided states that candidates will often try to win over in order to gain ground in an election. Swing states don't have more power in an election. They are simply states that aren't completely dedicated to one party over another, and therefore receive special attention during elections as people don't always know which way they're going to vote. And moreover, swing states change all the time. California, for instance, used to be safely Republican until it was won over by Clinton in the 1990s. The Electoral College does not show favoritism. Instead, it prevents it.
The Electoral College incentivizes most people not to vote. Why should they, when they live in a state that doesn't decide anything?
I hate to break it to you, Bhaskar, but I think the only one here convincing people that their vote doesn't matter is you.
And there's simply no evidence that the Electoral College helps us. Countries like Finland or Portugal elect their heads of state directly and are more vibrant and participatory democracies as a result.
Now, this graph is quite interesting. It shows that a much higher percentage of people vote in these other countries than in America. Bhaskar blames this on the Electoral College as these other countries don't have one. However, I don't think the Electoral College is the root cause of the low voter turnout in America. Instead, I think a lack of political motivation and purpose is to blame. People have grown complacent and take for granted the liberties they enjoy. It also might have something to do with people being taught that their vote doesn't matter if they don't live in a swing state. The video goes on to explain how undemocratic the rest of our government is and question the value of the Constitution. I can't even anymore.
The Constitution intended to secure elite rule and prevent democratic movements from forming. Because of it, every 4 years we have to worry about undemocratic elections in a country ostensibly founded on liberty and equality. There are simply better ways to run a government.
Well, Bhaskar, I'm afraid that thousands of years of history would disagree with you. I think a lot of us have been brought up to believe that democracy is a great thing, that democracy is fair, and that it's the solution to all of the world's problems. And I think because of that, we've gotten into this mentality that if we can just pump enough democracy into government, it will cease to be corrupt, evil, and oppressive. But as history shows, that's simply not true. Direct democracy leads to more oppression, not less. Our founding fathers knew this when they created not a democracy, but a republic based on universal truths and principles. So before tearing down our system of government, take some time and try to understand why it was built the way it was, and how it produced the freest nation on earth. The Gravel Institute, along with many other far leftists, would have you believe that our country was founded to serve the purposes of a bunch of racist white dudes who died a couple hundred years ago. But I think if you study the men who founded our country, their lives, and what they wrote, you'll find a much different story. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned a thing or two. I've left links in the video description to all the external resources I referenced in this video, as well as a link to a speech by Michael Knowles about the history of democracies. If you're interested in learning more about what I talked about in this video, I highly recommend you go and watch that. I'm Josiah. Thanks for watching. I love how I haven't posted a video in months except a 20-second meme, and then I just drop like a 10-minute political video. That's how it be sometimes.